If you have ever spent more than 5 minutes talking to an American who has just returned from a trip to the United Kingdom, you probably noticed they did not really want to talk about Big Ben. They did not care about the London Eye, and they barely mentioned seeing Buckingham Palace. Instead, they wanted to talk about some completely random, utterly mundane aspect of daily British life that absolutely blew their mind. It is a universal truth of international travel. When we Americans cross the Atlantic and step foot on British soil, our brains undergo some kind of profound psychological rewiring. We go over expecting to see kings, queens, red telephone booths, and Harry Potter castles, but we come home utterly obsessed with grocery stores, plumbing, laundry habits, and public transport. I have been living here in London as an American expat for almost 2 years now, and I still catch myself doing this exact same thing when I call my family back in the States. I will spend 40 minutes passionately explaining the genius of the British supermarket layout instead of talking about the actual historic museums I visited that day. There is an illusion of total similarity because we both speak English, but the moment you start living your actual day-to-day life here, you realize the micro shocks are everywhere. It starts the second you land at Heathrow and realize the border agent says cheers instead of welcome. So today we are going to dive deep into the 9 things Americans literally cannot stop talking about after visiting the United Kingdom. And trust me, if you are British, some of these are going to make you realize just how unique and fascinating your normal daily routine actually is compared to the rest of the world. Let's start with the absolute mind warp that is British history and our completely warped American sense of time. In the United States, we have a highly skewed perspective on what qualifies as old. If a building in Boston, Philadelphia, or Chicago was built in the early 1900s, we put a giant brass historical plaque on it, declare it a protected landmark, and treat it like an ancient relic of a bygone era. But when you land in the United Kingdom, your sense of chronological scale is completely shattered. You will walk into a local pub in a tiny countryside village in the Cotswolds to grab a quick pint of cider, and the bartender will casually mention that the building has been standing since the year 1400. You go to visit a grand estate or a historic castle, and the tour guide will casually point to a stone corridor and refer to it as the modern wing, only for you to realize that modern to them means it was constructed in 1520. There is a common saying over here that captures this perfectly. Americans think 100 years is a massive amount of time, while British people think 100 miles is a massive distance. It is absolutely true. When Americans go back home, they look at their local suburban strip malls, which were constructed in 1998, and suddenly everything in the US feels incredibly temporary and paper thin. They talk about walking down cobblestone streets that were paved before the concept of America even existed. They marvel at how people just casually live their daily lives in terraced houses that have survived multiple world wars, plagues, and ancient monarchs. Many of these homes are actually Grade 2 listed buildings, which is a legal designation, meaning you cannot even change the wooden window frames or paint the front door without strict government permission. Americans go back home with a completely re-evaluated sense of history, staring at their local grocery store built in the 90s like it was built yesterday. It is a profound, almost existential shock that we literally cannot shut up about because it forces us to realize just how young our own country really is. Well, if you are absolutely loving this trip down memory lane and my constant state of confusion over here, do me a huge favor and hype this video up in the comments and hit that like button to show some love. It seriously means the world to me and helps keep this expat dream alive. Now, we need to talk about the absolute obsession Americans have with British supermarkets, specifically places like Marks and Spencer, Sainsbury's, and Tesco. If you grew up in the UK, you probably just see these places as where you grab a quick sandwich, a package of crumpets, or your standard weekly grocery haul. But to an American, it is a holy temple of culinary perfection and structural organization. When Americans return home, they immediately start complaining about US grocery stores because of the food freshness and quality. Over here in the UK, if you buy a loaf of bread from the bakery section, it will go moldy in about 3 to 4 days because it does not have the massive amount of chemical preservatives that our food has back home. In the United States, our bread can sit on the kitchen counter for an entire month and still look brand new. This is because the European Food Safety Authority and the UK regulations are incredibly strict, banning hundreds of chemical additives, artificial dyes, and heavy preservatives that are completely legal under the US FDA. This means when Americans eat in the UK, they notice they do not feel bloated, heavy, or sluggish. They are eating real, whole foods with ingredients they can actually pronounce. And then there is the classic egg mystery. Every American who steps into a British supermarket is utterly baffled to find the egg sitting on a regular room temperature shelf next to the canned beans, instead of being kept in a refrigerated dairy case. We have to explain to them that in the UK, chickens are vaccinated against salmonella under the British Lion scheme, which keeps the protective natural coating of the eggshell intact, meaning they do not need refrigeration. In the US, our eggs are chemically washed, which strips that natural barrier and forces us to keep them cold from the farm to the table. It is a tiny structural detail, but it is a massive talking point. And we cannot forget the glorious cultural phenomenon of the supermarket meal deal, which Americans wish they could import immediately. The concept of getting a fresh main like a prawn mayonnaise sandwich, a snack like Walker's Crisps, and a drink like an innocent smoothie for less than £4 is a masterclass in value that makes our US grab-and-go options look like a total scam. Also, this is exactly the kind of thing I go much deeper on with the people who support this channel directly. So if you're sitting there thinking, okay, I need the fuller version of these bizarre travel stories, join the membership below. That's where I share the deeper thoughts, the more personal side of my expat journey, and the extra bits I can't always fit into the main videos. The third thing we always talk about is a design choice that has been baffling American tourists and expat residents since the dawn of modern indoor plumbing: the separate hot and cold water taps in the bathroom sinks. You walk into a beautifully preserved Edwardian home or a historic local pub, you go to wash your hands, and you are faced with an impossible choice. Do you want to freeze your fingers off under the ice-cold tap on the left, or do you want to get actual third-degree burns from the boiling hot tap on the right? There is no middle ground. There is no mixer tap to give you a comfortable, lukewarm stream of water. Americans literally do not understand the engineering logic behind this. But there is actually a fascinating historical and legal reason for it. Historically, this started because older British homes had cold water coming directly from the clean main supply, which was safe to drink, while the hot water was fed from a storage tank in the attic, which was often open to the elements and could theoretically be contaminated with dust or pests. To prevent the clean drinking water from mixing with the tank water, building regulations legally mandated that the pipes and the taps remain entirely separate. Today, even though modern heating systems make this obsolete, the tradition persists in so many homes and public establishments. Americans go home and tell their friends about the elaborate hand-washing dance they had to perform, frantically cupping water from both sides just to get clean without losing their skin, or attempting to plug the sink entirely, which feels deeply unhygienic to us because we do not like washing our hands in standing water. It is a hilarious quirk of British domestic life that highlights how much the UK values historical tradition over modern convenience. The fourth thing we cannot stop talking about is the sheer joy of walking and the magic of public transport. In the United States, unless you live in a massive, dense city like New York or Boston, your daily life is completely dominated by your automobile. You drive to the grocery store, you drive to work, you drive to the coffee shop, and you drive to the gym. If you try to walk down a suburban street in America, you will find that the sidewalk often just abruptly ends in a patch of grass, and drivers will look at you like you are a highly suspicious character. But in the UK, walking is not just a way to get from point A to point B, it is a fundamental, deeply respected way of life. Americans return from London, York, or Edinburgh, and they are practically glowing because they were casually walking 15,000 steps a day without even stepping foot in a gym. The cities over here were built for human beings. Horses and carriages centuries before the automobile lobby reshaped American suburbs into giant concrete parking lots. In the UK, public footpaths are protected by ancient laws, meaning you can walk right through a farmer's field on a designated path, whereas in the US, that would get you arrested for trespassing. And then there is the train system. The fact that you can hop on a quiet, high-speed train and be in a completely different city or a peaceful countryside village in under an hour is mind-blowing to an American. But the biggest shock of all is the legal concept of jaywalking. In the US, crossing the street outside of a designated pedestrian crosswalk is actually a crime that can get you a hefty fine from the police. Over here, jaywalking is not even a concept in the highway code. Pedestrians have a massive amount of priority, and you cross the road whenever and wherever you want, dodging those iconic black cabs with a sense of ultimate, lawless freedom. Americans talk about this like they have just escaped a driving prison. Quick thing before we get to the final, most baffling things on this list. The data on this channel shows that over 80% of you watching right now are not subscribed. That means you are showing up for the expat culture shocks, but the algorithm has no reason to show you the next video. Hit subscribe so you do not miss the next one. Now, let's talk about the absolute sacred institution that is the British pub. When Americans think of a pub, they usually picture a dark, slightly dingy bar where people go to get cheap drinks after a long day of work. But once you actually visit a real British pub, you realize it is completely different. It is essentially a community living room. You walk in on a Sunday afternoon and you see entire families sitting together. There are toddlers playing with wooden toys on the carpet, grandparents sharing a roast dinner, and local dogs literally sitting on the bar stools like regular customers. It is incredibly wholesome. The physical structure of these pubs with their low wooden beams, cozy brick fireplaces, and sticky carpets feels like a warm hug. It is a place of community, hosting local pub quizzes on Tuesday nights and bringing neighbors together. Americans are also completely caught off guard by the ordering etiquette. In the US, you sit at a table, a server comes to take your order, and you run a credit card tab that stays open until you leave. In a British pub, you walk up to the bar, you order your pint of local ale or cider, you pay immediately, and you carry your own drinks back to your table. There is no waiting around for a bill, and there is no massive tipping culture pressure because staff are paid a proper wage. Americans absolutely love this simplicity. They go home and constantly talk about how much they miss the cozy, low-stress vibe of their local neighborhood pub, especially after experiencing a traditional Sunday roast with giant, fluffy Yorkshire puddings drowned in rich gravy. Next up is a domestic shock that leaves every American tourist completely disoriented: the washing machine in the kitchen. In the US, laundry is usually relegated to a basement, a garage, or a dedicated laundry room. So when an American rents an Airbnb in London and finds the washing machine tucked neatly under the kitchen counter, right next to the dishwasher and the food prep area, their brain takes a second to process it. Why are we washing our dirty socks right next to where we make our morning toast? There is actually a legal reason for this based on UK building safety regulations. British electrical laws are incredibly strict, stating that you cannot have high voltage outlets or standard light switches in a wet room like a bathroom unless the outlet is located at least 3 meters away from the bath or shower. Because British bathrooms are historically quite small, the kitchen is the only wet room in the house where it is legally safe to install a high voltage outlet for a washing machine. And then comes the real tragedy, which is the absolute lack of tumble dryers. Most British households do not have a separate dryer, and if they do, it is a combined washer-dryer unit that takes 4 hours to dry a single t-shirt and leaves it smelling slightly damp. Tumble dryers are often viewed as energy-guzzling monsters that destroy clothing, which aligns with the general green mindset over here, combined with the fact that electricity is significantly more expensive in the UK than in the US. Instead, everyone over here relies on the clothes horse, which is a folding metal rack that you expand in the middle of your living room to air dry your clothes. Americans return home talking about how their entire British holiday was spent navigating around a damp forest of wet laundry in their living rooms, praying that their jeans would dry before their flight home. The seventh thing Americans always discuss is the fascinating, deeply polite, yet slightly passive-aggressive nature of British social interaction. It starts with the phrase, "You all right?" To a British person, this is not a question. It is simply a casual greeting, equivalent to saying hello or what's up. But to an American, who takes language very literally, it sounds like an expression of deep concern. For the first few weeks I lived here, every time a shopkeeper or a barista asked me, "You all right?" I would freeze up and think, oh my gosh, do I look tired? Am I pale? Is there something wrong with my face? And I would start explaining my entire morning to them before realizing they had already walked away. It is a psychological trap that we all fall into. There is a major difference in communication styles. American culture is built on positive politeness, which involves being overly enthusiastic, loud, and friendly, shouting greetings across a room and complimenting absolute strangers. British culture is built on negative politeness, which is all about avoiding intrusion, respecting personal space, and not making a scene. And then there is the apology culture. British people say sorry more than any other population on earth. If you are walking down a street in London and someone steps on your foot, you will find yourself saying sorry to them. If you bump into a mannequin in a shop, you will apologize to the plastic. It is an automatic reflex. Americans find this polite obsession incredibly endearing, but also slightly hilarious. They go home trying to adopt this polite demeanor, but they usually fail because American culture is just naturally much louder and more direct. Number 8 is something that Americans talk about with a mixture of confusion and genuine panic: the complete absence of window screens and air conditioning. In the United States, almost every single window has a mesh screen to keep bugs, flies, and mosquitoes out of the house. We also have central air conditioning in nearly every building, especially in the warmer states. So when Americans visit the UK in the summer, they are met with two distinct shocks. First, when they open the windows to catch a breeze, they realize there are no screens, which means spiders, wasps, and gigantic flies can enter their bedrooms completely unchallenged. It feels like an invite-only party for local insects. The native insect population in the UK is relatively harmless compared to the venomous creatures we have in the US, so screens were historically never deemed necessary, but to an American waking up with a giant house spider on the wall, it feels like a survival movie. Second, if there is even a slight rise in temperature, say 80 degrees Fahrenheit, the entire country enters a state of national emergency. Because British homes are built out of thick brick to keep heat in during the freezing winters, they essentially act as clay ovens during the summer. Without air conditioning, Americans find themselves melting inside their rooms, desperately trying to sleep with a tiny desk fan blowing lukewarm air at them. They return home with a newfound appreciation for their giant US air conditioners, but they never stop laughing about how a little bit of sunshine can bring the entire British infrastructure and train tracks to a grinding halt. Finally, we have the sheer, futuristic convenience of British payment systems. In the US, cash is still relatively common, and our card transactions often involve signing a piece of paper or dealing with glitchy card readers. But in the UK, cash is basically dead. Americans return from their trips completely amazed by how they did not have to touch a single physical coin or paper bill the entire time they were there. Contactless payment, or tap to pay, is an absolute religion over here. The US banking system is highly fragmented, with thousands of small local banks, making technological rollouts incredibly slow. The UK has a highly consolidated banking sector, allowing for a unified rollout of contactless systems. You can tap your phone or your card to pay a street performer in Covent Garden, to buy a single banana at a local corner shop, or even to pay 50 pence to enter a public toilet in a train station. The integration of Apple Pay and contactless on the London Underground, where you literally just tap your phone on the yellow reader to ride the subway, is something Americans talk about like it is alien technology. We go back to our local US towns, where we still have to swipe cards and sign receipts, and we feel like we have been dragged back into the Stone Age. It is a level of efficiency that makes us realize just how far behind our own banking systems really are. At the end of the day, these cultural differences are exactly why we travel in the first place. It is not just about seeing the famous monuments that we have watched in movies. It is about experiencing the quirky, everyday realities of another country and realizing that there are completely different ways to live, to eat, to wash your hands, and to pay for your morning coffee. If you are an American who has visited the UK, let me know in the comments which of these shocks hit you the hardest, or if there is something else that completely blew your mind that I missed. And if you are British, please let me know if you find our obsession with your daily life as hilarious as I think you do. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.